It all looked so familiar. I had lived in the village of Fenny Doveton for the first 10 years of my life. Unfortunately, my father had succumbed to consumption when I was but a baby, and my dear mother had remarried when I was 9 years old. My stepfather detested me heartily, and had made her life a misery on my account. He soon sent me away to Harrow and then Oxford. When I was absent, he treated my mother generously and kindly, so Reverend Kenworthy, our vicar, had informed me in his monthly letters. I had never been back since, but on receiving news of my stepfather's death, I had now returned to see my dear mother. She and I had kept in touch by fond letters in the 15 years since I had been sent away. I had 2 half-brothers I had never met, Gawain and Percival, named in accordance with the fashion for all things Arthurian promoted by Her Majesty and her admirable consort. After university I had gained employment as a clerk with the Caribbean and Colonial Trading Company, and had worked my way up in the 4 years since, to the position of Assistant District Manager for Tobago. When I received the tidings of my stepfather's unlamented death, I went to see Mr. Edward Tompkins, my senior. "Mr. Tompkins, I've today received a letter from my dear mother, in which she conveys to me the news that my stepfather has recently died. Although it is clearly impossible for me to return in time for the funeral, yet I would very much like to visit my mother and offer whatever consolation is within my power." Mr. Tompkins was fully cognizant of my circumstances, and had indeed kindly taken it upon himself to act as the father I had never had. "Of course, you must return to England forthwith, my dear Michael. I shall arrange for you to take 6 weeks' leave with immediate effect." In due course I arrived in Southampton, and took the train to London and then on to Fenny Doveton. I had been sadly perplexed as to what gift I should take for my mother, but remembering her affection for animals, and for birds in particular, I had brought her a very beautiful green parrot. I got said parrot from a Tobagonian I knew, who vouched for her friendly nature and intelligence. The bird was just 3 years old, which was excellent, as my mother would enjoy Lola's company for many years to come, since parrots are famously long-lived. The bird had seemed to enjoy the long Atlantic crossing, and had been very well behaved. In fact, she had become a favourite with passengers and crew, and I had often taken her cage on deck and into the saloon during the voyage. My only regret was that she had displayed no talent for imitating human speech, and indeed had said not a single word since I had procured her. Still, she was very fine, and gave an impression of listening intently to every word said to her, cocking her head to one side in a most endearing fashion. She appeared to enjoy her train journey too, and showed no ill effects of travel, and consequently I had removed her chenille cage cover en route. There were some children in the carriage who were very much taken with her. In the fullness of time the train chugged into Fenny Doveton, and Lola and I alighted. One of my mother's neighbours, a very fat lady, I remember, called Mrs. Walters, alighted too. I walked up the platform behind her. As she waddled along in front of me, Lola chose that moment to end her vow of silence. "Avast behind!" she squawked loudly, in a voice not dissimilar to my own. Mrs. Walters swivelled round majestically and fixed me with a beady eye. "What did you say, young man?" she demanded menacingly. "Oh, nothing at all, I assure you, madam," I stammered. She made a snorting noise and turned away. "A great taballade!" shrieked Lola. Mrs. Walters turned back and started to quiver with rage like a gigantic jelly. It is only a parrot, dear lady. It is merely imitating the sailors on our recent sea voyage." I hastily pulled the cover over Lola's cage and hurried away to my mother's house in Greenacres Lane. I had not been able to advise her which train I would be on, but she had promised to wait in for me. Our reunion was joyful indeed. My mother declared me a very fine young man, and her dear face looked just the same to my filial eye as when I had last seen her. We sat down happily to talk and take tea together. My mother was altogether delighted with Lola, and very naughtily amused by the incident on the station platform. My half-brothers were introduced, and appeared to be very amiable young fellows of 14 and 12 years. "My dearest boy," said Mamma, "I have invited a few neighbours and old friends to take a glass of wine with us this evening, to celebrate this happiest of reunions." After dinner, a crowd of friends descended on the house. Gawain and Percival were most attentive at filling the glasses and passing around plates of devils on horseback and smoked oysters. Many of my father's friends came and greeted me fondly, declaring themselves pleased I had turned out so well under such trying circumstances. "Pray silence all," said my dear mother. "My darling son Michael has brought me a delightful gift from Tobago. This is Lola." She drew off the chenille cover as she spoke. There were murmurings of approval. Lola was indeed a remarkably fine specimen. Alderman Bertram Arbuthnot approached the cage. My mother disliked him, as he had had the audacity to make overtures to her shortly after my father's demise, but he had to be invited to every occasion. He was an unpleasantly flatulent man, and his presence always led to much plying of fans amongst the ladies. "An excellent bird, indeed," he said to my mother, breathing heavily in her direction. My mother leaned away from him.
"There's an ill wind in the rigging tonight, Captain,"
remarked Lola in her piercing voice. Gawain and Percival collapsed with laughter in a most unseemly manner. So too, sadly, did our venerable Reverend Kenworthy. The alderman looked angry and embarrassed, and shortly took himself away, to everyone's relief.
"What an interesting bird,"
said Dr. Mort, our inefficacious medical man. It was he who had diagnosed my father's consumption as a slight chest cold, and thus delayed the treatment which might have prolonged his life.
15 guineas for a dead man's chest,"
exclaimed Lola angrily. Everyone was silent. They all knew Dr. Mort's reputation. "I think perhaps we shall draw the evening to a close now," said my mother in her most dignified manner. "It has been most delightful to see you all." It was clear that Lola would not be very welcome in Fenny Doveton, and I reluctantly decided that she would have to return to Tobago with me when I sailed. You may therefore imagine my delight when my dear mother declared shortly afterwards that, as there was nothing to keep her in England, she and my 2 half-brothers would come along and join me in the Caribbean. Consequently, a month later, we closed up the house in Fenny Doveton, packed my mother's and brother's belongings into trunks, and set off down to Southampton with Lola. Gawain and Percival flourished in Tobago, as did my darling mother. She and Mr. Tomkins quickly came to a most satisfactory understanding, and were married the following December.